San Francisco, a lot of tech action today.
Our top stories this morning in D.C. and
the Dow and the S&P.
Shall we? So the euro on a 7-day
sizable moves in the currency market. Averages down 0.5%.
We begin in the oil patch. Saudi Arabia.
Brent crude pretty much unchanged.
Welcome to Bloomberg, the first word Asia.
The U.S. and Japan duke it out over exchange.
China's slumping onshore bond market.
It's almost 11 o'clock here in Hong Kong, 1 p.m. in Sydney. I'm Sherry Yan.
And I'm David Ingles. We're in the middle of this Asian trading session. Welcome to Bloomberg Markets Asia.
Striking Syria, the U.S. launches cruise missiles after the gas attack President Trump said was an affront to humanity.
And we're seeing gold, oil, and other haven assets surge in response. Russia had warned an attack would have, quote, consequences.
Elsewhere, the Samsung heir appears in court as his company shows it's surviving a string of scandals.
And this new hawkish tone at the RBR, Governor Urjit Patel is increasingly concerned over inflation. Yeah, but I mean, certainly, Sherry, the big story, of course, we've been following all morning is the market reaction to these attacks, to this missile launches, if you will, on Syria by the U.S. We talked about gold, we talked about the yen. You're going to flesh it out for us.
Yeah, I mean, there was this sharp reversal. The market was just in a holding pattern, and all of a sudden you see these attacks, and then we're getting these sharp market reactions. So let's take you through that. Of course, this is just reflecting uncertainty about President Trump's policies, because remember, this is only coming 2 days after that gas attack in Syria. And even before that, there was some sort of acceptance by President Trump that Bashar al-Assad's rule would continue. But this just shows more uncertainty over his policies. So we are seeing gold now reversing 2 days of losses, spiking at 1264 at the moment, at the highest level this year. Japanese yen just giving up earlier losses to gain strength. And now we're seeing it just getting close to that 109.93 level. Now remember, that's a 50% Fibonacci retracement line right now at the highest against the dollar since November. Oil, Brent, just past $56 a barrel. Remember, Syria is not really a big oil producer, but what this means is that it could signal escalation in the region, and that is what's having investors nervous right now. And we're seeing this continued momentum gathering in this risk-off sentiment, and you can, of course, see it in U.S. 10-year Treasury yields. Now, they held steady for a while in that range this year. It broke through the range as soon as we got reports of the Syria attack. Right now, the yield at 2.31, but it fell as much as 2.28. And this, of course, a key level that we hadn't seen breached in quite some time since the November election of President Trump. And remember, given the 10-year yields have actually seen that double top, this technically could mean that we could see yields falling to as much to 175-185% range. And now, the idea right now is that these moves could fade away because these attacks on Syria don't necessarily have any direct impact on the markets. But Bloomberg strategists are saying that given all of the geopolitical risks out there, we could see these market moves continuing, David. So this is something that we're keeping a close eye on.
Yeah, thanks, Shade. So let's get you guys up to date on what's happening here. Of course, our top story, President Trump has confirmed a U.S. missile strike on Syrian government airbase in retaliation for this week's chemical weapons attack near Idlib that killed, of course, dozens of civilians. Now, joining us live from Palm Beach, where the President Trump is, of course, meeting the Chinese President Xi Jinping, is Bloomberg's Nick Waddups. Nick, bring us up to date.
Well, we just had a press conference from the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. I mean, they're making clear that this was an act that crossed a line. The chemical attack in Idlib crossed a line and necessitated a response from the administration. They say Russia was advised. But Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, in really sort of interesting language, basically put moral responsibility for this attack at the feet of Russia, which is has long backed the president of Syria, saying that they failed to live up to their end of the bargain in 2013 when they reached a deal with President Barack Obama, basically to remove Syria's chemical weapons. So you're seeing the U.S. draw a direct line between this attack and the Russian president in Moscow.
And Nick, I just wonder if this shift, this very rapid and dramatic shift in U.S. policy towards Syria could also give more significance to what's happening to North Korea. What can we expect on that front? Because that's a huge priority as well.
I mean, you've seen a lot tougher language. You know, this is one of the most interesting sort of undercurrents of this administration so far. You know, they've basically drawn 3 red lines already in 76 days. One on North Korea, one on Syria, and then one on Iran in the early days of Trump's presidency. So now that the Syrian regime crossed that red line, you've seen this response. I mean, clearly the administration, you saw some tweets from Kellyanne Conway saying, you know, that an action like this is not only directed at Syria, it's meant to cause other governments and regimes to sort of stand up and take notice. Clearly, they're hoping that North Korea will do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, you know, a lot of people are asking what's next. When you look at the markets, we saw an initial sort of knee-jerk reaction. What are the Democrats saying amid all of this? I imagine any further action from the U.S. would require this to go through Congress.
Well, I think, I mean, the reaction, as you would expect, is pretty mixed. But there had been a push for a long time for the U.S. to do this by congressmen on both sides of the aisle saying, you know, listen, if they're doing these attacks, why don't we take out their air assets? So something that would not necessarily involve U.S. troops. I mean, the question now is what the next step is. Is this a one-off action where the U.S. sort of says, okay, we've taken an action that has a real effect and also sends a very strong message, or does the U.S. look to now get more strategically involved and involved in a longer-term battle here? I mean, this is a civil war that's been going on for almost 7 years, so and the U.S. has so far resisted. So members of Congress saying, listen, if you want to take any further action, that's something that would need to be done in consultation with Congress.
So what will happen in terms of diplomacy in the region? Because when it comes to Syria, we are seeing that it's not only about the U.S. and Syria. We also have Russia, Iran, and also Turkey involved. Turkey, we know that they have moderated their stance against Assad because of these Kurdish rebels in Syria and their own interests. What can we expect in these talks between all of these countries?
I mean, you know, that's one reason why this is just one of the most complicated and sort of bedeviling foreign policy problems really to face the world in decades. There are so many outside actors. I mean, the big test coming up next will be that Secretary of State Tillerson goes from here to Italy for a G7 summit, and then he's scheduled to go on to Moscow for a day of meetings with top officials there. possibly including a meeting with Vladimir Putin. State Department officials are telling us that that meeting is expected to still go ahead. That trip will happen as planned. But those are going to be some very difficult talks where Rex Tillerson will be sort of asked to account for the U.S. position, but will also very likely face extremely strong pushback from the Russian government, which says that, that the Syrian regime was not to blame for this chemical attack.
Mick Wadham's there. Thanks for joining us. And of course, the Russians also saying this morning, Sherry, that there will be negative consequences. And just to recap, of course, for our viewers who are just tuning in, just a recap of what happened. About 2 hours ago, the U.S. launched about 60 cruise missiles, of course, fired into Syria, aimed at targeting the Sarin storage at an airfield there. That's according to Pentagon officials. It was a limited strike early on Friday, aimed at hangars, planes, and fuel tanks at the Shariat airfield. That's according to U.S. officials there as well. So that happened about 2 hours ago, and since then we've heard, of course, a lot of responses here. Right. China is obviously also going to be in the mix here, Sherry.
Yeah, this coming at an important time because we do have President Xi Jinping in the U.S., in Florida right now, trying to carry out these talks with President Trump. So let's cross over to Beijing for the reaction there. Our China correspondent, Tom McKenzie, standing by. Tom, so a very crucial time for these two countries, especially when it comes to China. Can we expect to hear from the Chinese on this one?
Absolutely. We have yet to hear from the Chinese on this. We're expecting a response at around 3 p.m. local time. That's when the Foreign Ministry gives their daily briefing. We're expecting probably a statement that is relatively bland, probably one that calls for an easing of tensions, that calls for a resumption of peace talks, perhaps, between the various different parties involved in the Syria conflict. But take a step back, and this overshadows this meeting between the two presidents, a meeting that the Chinese have put so much effort into, a meeting that was going to, they hoped, underscore President Xi's standing on the international stage. For that, and for the Chinese in that respect, this is a concern. Now, bringing it back to Syria precisely, the Chinese have in the past vetoed resolutions, UN resolutions targeting Syria, including the one after the last chemical attack that was believed to have been carried out by Assad's regime. And China, along with Russia, blocked that. And China has investments in Syria. Sinopec has investments in the northeast of the country. And just in terms of the geopolitics, China has long gone for this non-interference in international affairs. They are very much opposed to any signs that the US or its allies might be trying to topple a government or a leader. They're viscerally opposed to that. And we're expecting that stance to continue. But it's possible that President Xi may try to give some kind of supportive stance because he is being hosted by Trump, of course. And then you've got the example for the Chinese, what happened in Libya. They had about $20 billion worth of assets that were lost in the civil war there. And then they have their own internal threats. They have Uyghur militants from the western provinces of China that have been training, some of them in Syria, and have threatened China domestically as well. So it's a complex issue for China, and the messaging we're going to be listening out for at the Foreign Ministry, but likely to hear the same kind of response we've heard previously from China on this issue.
One place where China has been very involved in has been North Korea, and this was supposed to feature heavily in the Xi-Trump summit. Now that we have this ongoing geopolitical background where you have U.S. foreign policy being very uncertain, what sort of repercussions is this going to have when China deals with North Korea in the future, and what sort of concessions Trump will ask on this front?
Well, again, it underscores, doesn't it, that the Chinese are dealing with an unpredictable president in President Trump. And it also likely increases the pressure that we've already seen put on the Chinese from Washington to take a stronger stance on North Korea, because it shows that Washington, that President Trump, is ready to act, that he is prepared to take military action. And we know that the Americans have said that a preemptive strike on North Korea is not off the table, and that they say that the time for talking has ended, that 20 years of diplomacy have ended. But we've also know that the Americans have said that the Chinese, they want to see the Chinese toughening these sanctions against North Korea, taking a bigger step to put economic pressure on North Korea, because, of course, China accounts for the vast majority of its trade and its energy and its food supplies. other than that, we haven't seen a new direction for Washington's stance on North Korea and how exactly it wants China to act on this. But I think the fact that they've taken this missile strike and used this, or at least taken the step to have them take a missile strike against Syria, does raise the ante. It does certainly underline for the Chinese that the Americans are prepared to act in certain scenarios. North Korea, though, of course, is a very different set of scenarios. They're a different question. They have a huge military arsenal facing South Korea. So the military operation there, if there was one, would be far more complex, far more dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Tom McKenzie there live for us in Beijing. He'll be all over that story, the Chinese response when it does come, of course, in the press conference. Now, back to markets here, just very, very quickly. Have a look at implied vol, Hang Seng Index in Japan. Have a look at my Bloomberg right now. So we saw an initial spike up, unexpected. We've come down a little bit. The blue line is Hang Seng. The white line is your Nikkei VIX. And I think the message now coming from the markets is essentially we've seen this initial move into risk aversion. Now, it really depends on what the next steps will be or what happens next, whether or not we will see that second leg of move back into these safe haven assets. In the meantime, of course, Sherry?
We are seeing the Nikkei now very close to that 18,500 line, which we last saw that in January, already breaking that 4-month range. Although the topics, I gotta say, in the morning session, it remained on the upside despite the strength in the Japanese yen. Let's cross over to Sophie Kamarudin for a detail of what's happening across markets here in Asia as that risk-off sentiment reverberates. Sophie.
Yeah, so you guys pointed out we are seeing that knee-jerk reaction. Remains to be seen whether that will continue. U.S. futures slumping, gold and oil surging. We are seeing U.S. Treasury 10-year yields sliding to the lowest since November. But to put it into perspective, the moves aren't particularly large. For example, the yen rose more last Monday. But this strike, that's stoking questions about Trump's policy, and that adds security concerns perhaps to the U.S.-China summit. And as Shaw and Partners wealth manager James Audis puts it, the markets, they've been looking for a reason to sell off. So we are seeing right across the board for the most part here. Asian stocks set for a second day lower. But we do have stocks in Manila, one of the only gainers today. We do have Chinese stocks swinging. And the Nikkei 225, as you pointed out, Sherry, lower here, down 0.1% at the morning close. And just taking a look at some other laggards in the region, we do have the likes of Singapore, New Zealand, and Taiwan leading the drop here. The TAIEX falling the most since November. Shares in Hong Kong, those are falling more than 1%, just hovering above the 24,000 point level. H shares, those are dropping for a second day. Volatility spiking, as David, you mentioned. And we are seeing divergence, of course, with the topics. The Kospi, that is falling for a fourth straight day. It already had, of course, that the cloud of North Korean risk just above that. So the Kospi down about 0.2%. And taking a look at the currency space, we do have the Taiwanese dollar leading the drop in Asia, falling for a sixth day. Southeast Asian currencies, they're getting waxed today. And the Korean won, that is falling to the lowest since mid-March. And taking a look at the dollar yen, we do have it up about 0.3% here. It may test the 110 level, which we have not seen since November. Now, looking at commodities, gold up about 1% here, nearing a 5-month high. It's driving a rally in precious metals as well. And with bullion having broken that February high, we may see 1,300 an ounce in sight. And take a look at oil. We have both New York crude and Brent climbing almost 2% here. Taking a look at the way that oil has been trading, WTI above $52, Brent earlier spiking above 56. Syria, it borders Iraq, and that is OPEC's second biggest producer. Syria, though, it's not a big oil producer per se, but it does potentially increase the risk of escalation in the region, according to CMC Markets' Rick Spooner. And he says that these price gains will likely be capped given rising supply, inventory sizes, and the extent of the pickup in shale output. And Nomura agrees, unless we see something beyond military containment, these gains may have a ceiling. Guys.
Yeah, Sophie, thanks for that. That's Sophie Kamarudin, of course, on the markets. Now, let's get more on this story. We're joined right now by Uwe Parpar, Chief Strategist at Capital Link International. Uwe, thanks for coming on the program. I mean, we were supposed to be talking about North Korea, China, and the U.S. In a lot of ways, it's hard to imagine the timing wasn't on purpose. When they were meeting, this thing happened. So in that way, I guess we're also going to be talking about how this then sort of colors the hues here when it comes to these talks between China, the U.S., and, of course, the North Korean issue. Overall, though, initial reactions and, does the sort of risk-off positioning that we've seen so far, first hour or so. Make sense?
Well, that's normal. I mean, you always see that. That's the first reaction until people have some time to think about it. First thing is to, well, the obvious reaction is oil, first of all, the price of oil going up. Then the yen is the usual suspect of going up in the risk-averse environment.
Right.
So nothing special about that. I think that'll just sort of dissipate over time.
Yeah, the question would be how soon, because could this be different from before? Like before we see these sorts of moves because they don't necessarily directly impact the markets, they tend to dissipate. But given all of the geopolitical risks right now, would this risk of sentiment last longer than usual?
I don't think so. I think actually what you might see is a pretty positive reaction because I'm sure that this was signaled to President Xi, over dinner rather than being sprung on him. The very clear message here is by Trump that, look, if you are not going to collaborate with us on North Korea, then we will be forced to go in that direction. I think China will see it in its own interest to have some signal to the effect that they're going to act on North Korea as well.
As a chief strategist, what's the next thing you're looking at before we move on to other things? What's the next sort of thing that makes you then change your mind? All right, we have to start maybe paring back some more risk positions.
Well, there are always two things. I mean, one question is what I was just asked. How long does this last? And I said it might actually give way to a more positive reaction, depending on the outcome of the Mar-a-Lago. And second thing is, is there a buying opportunity here? My view is yes, buy Korea.
No, exactly. I was going to get to that. Why do you say buy Korea when there is the North Korea risk right there? And wouldn't this move by the Trump administration have exacerbated that risk?
No, I think it's a 0-1 situation. If there is going to be a war, then your bet is wrong. But if otherwise, if there isn't, then in fact, this is the first step toward a possible resolution. So why not go with that? At the same time, Korean stocks are perennially undervalued. I mean, in terms of PE, there's the Korea, risk premium there. And, that will not come off, but it gives you an opportunity to actually jump in. Plus, you have today's Samsung results. What's not to like?
Do I buy an index stock?
I'm not so sure you want to buy an index stock. It's heavily weighted towards Samsung. That's really the index, so why not do it? I mean, 48% profit jump. What's wrong with that? So.
Is your thinking being affected also by the fact that we might get a new liberal administration in South Korea that's friendlier towards China as well as North Korea?
Yeah, that creates the possibility of a regional settlement, and I think that's what Trump will have to be looking for. There's no way of directly settling with North Korea, right? So the North Koreans want a settlement with the United States, but everybody else in the region wants a regional settlement, and therefore here's an opportunity for China, for Russia, for the United States, for Japan, for South Korea to come together and finally get the Korean War over.
Finally signed that peace treaty after, half a decade?
Yeah, I want to ask you about oil now and how that all plays into it. I mean, this may or may not change the complexion in the oil price. But before this happened anyway, we saw it slowly creeping up. OPEC might then step in, extend those cuts. They're almost boxed into a corner that they sort of have to right now. At 56, 57, are you still okay as far as, going long a lot of these sort of net importers of oil, like Korea, for example?
Yeah, I think unless we jump to something like 70, this is not going to really be a game changer. I think the important thing is, what's going to happen with OPEC? How does OPEC react at this point? They can always just, turn the spigot open a bit more. And the Russians were just discussing yesterday to actually comply with the OPEC restrictions. Now, under these circumstances, under these circumstances, why do so, right? I mean, I don't see any good reason for that. So.
Now, we are taking these moves as a one-off risk of sentiment right now because of these attacks on Syria. But if you take a look at the Bloomberg and you take a look at the Japanese yen, we are going to see that it's been strengthening for quite a while. And we had a slight weakness against the U.S. dollar in the last session, but again, with what's happening right now, it's pushing to that 50% Fibonacci retracement line. Given the current trend when it comes to the Japanese yen, should we be more bearish towards the Nikkei, given how affected they are by yen moves?
Well, again, I think this will come off in terms of the immediate, risk off or risk aversion situation. The sort of longer-term trend from 115 to 110 that we've been seeing had nothing to do with anything like this, right? That was much more a question of what's happening to the U.S. dollar. And I think the idea that the U.S. dollar is going to weaken over the longer term is wrong. I think there's no question that U.S. monetary policy will continue to be ahead of everybody else in terms of tightening, and that will support the dollar. So I think the yen will basically be trading around 115. And that's fine for the Nikkei. It doesn't need anything more.
Right. So, I mean, we'll continue the conversation later.
Yeah, sure.
Of course. So we'll get into the balance sheet, rate hikes, and a sort of mix that we see in terms of what the tightening will consist of. We'll be part there, of course, of Capital Link. Now, back to our top story here. We're joined on phone right now by Edward Jajarian. He's a former Syria and Israel ambassador, joining us live on the phone from Washington, D.C. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for joining us on the program. I just want to get your initial thoughts on the developments this morning. Were you surprised?
Yes, I think we were all surprised by the rapidity of this decision by President Trump and his national security team. I think the basic message here that the Trump administration is sending is that there are limits to the, let me call it, the strategic restraint of President Trump and his administration. I think they felt that the statements that they made in the last week that the administration would not be prioritizing the removal of President Bashar al-Assad of Syria may have been overinterpreted in Damascus and by the Russians and the Iranians, that they had a freer hand in Syria. I think the video images, the horrible images of the men, women, and children and babies being asphyxiated by the sarin gas attacks. Now, the administration has made clear that this was a sarin gas attack, that this seems to have really moved President Trump, and that he decided with his, as I said, his national security team, that a signal had to be sent, a very strong message had to be sent that there are limits to any sort of horrendous freedom of action that the Syrians and their supporters may think they have.
When you are saying it's a message and a signal, are you taking it as a one-off strike, a sort of line in the sand for the Trump administration, or could U.S. involvement in Syria continue for days and weeks ahead?
Nobody can predict that, as we all have learned in our engagements and going back to Vietnam, to Afghanistan, to Iraq. There can always be mission creep, and there can be further escalatory actions. A lot is going to depend now on what the reaction is on the ground in Syria from the Russians and the Iranians in the first instance. So nobody can answer that question. But I think the intent of the administration was to signal that a line has been drawn here. And I think
In San Francisco, a lot of tech action today.
Our top stories this morning in D.C. and
The Dow and the S&P.
Shall we? So the euro on a 7-day
sizable
winning
moves in the currency market. Averages down 0.5%.
We begin in the oil patch. Saudi Arabia.
Brent crude pretty much unchanged.
Leading to attack for yourself. Rebels could get gas through Turkey or Jordan. Thanks, Clinton. And McCain was in Syria about a month ago, and rebels gained everything from the gas attack. So you are another one voting for false flag, rebel-started gas attack. Thanks, Real World, for writing in. We have a message from Dawn here. Dawn writes, 50-50 on this attack. I feel that this can be used in a positive way to improve diplomatic relations. Maybe it will be. Thanks, Dawn. Eric Bazell says, people seem to forget that Trump wants to create a safe zone in Syria for refugees that are flooding and destabilizing Europe, and a stable Europe is in the interest of Russia and the U.S. Besides, I'm sure Putin and Trump are in contact and both want peace in the regions. Will there be an attempt to try to create a safe zone in Syria after this? Don't know. We'll see. Let's see here. The Bane of Bane writes in, a lot of people, including some of my friends, are saying this might be causing a World War III. At first I thought that might be an extreme statement, but now I'm thinking it might be possible. Would Syria attack back immediately? Will North Korea or Russia or even China join them? Would anybody help the U.S. in that case? Maybe we'll get lucky and everyone will be like, don't do it again and we'll all be fine. Again, we just can't tell. The more I think about it, the more I fear about people's safety. Fire against fire will only fan the flames further. Gonna leave the stream soon. Thanks for the news, man. You're the bomb. Wait, don't take that bomb as part of a pun. I didn't mean to make a pun. So thank you, Bane of Bane, for writing in. You know, Bane of Bane raises a good point, which is, I think it's easy to assume that like Syria won't do anything militarily in response. But might they? Might they fire something at a U.S. ship or something? Might they fire something at Israel? Might somebody else attack U.S. forces? Might there be some attack on U.S. forces? We have a bunch of forces right now in that region, in Syria, in Iraq, working on fighting ISIS. Are there attacks on them? Are there terrorist attacks on those forces? Might there be any terror attacks? Look, I hope it doesn't happen. Goodness forbid. But in the U.S. in relation to this. So what happens? Don't know. You know, it's very sensitive when you have American forces and American bombs are raining down in the Middle East. That can trigger some people in the Middle East or trigger people who are sympathetic to certain people. So we will see what happens. We are still covering here. We're not going anywhere. We are covering this military action by the United States tonight, firing 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles at Syria from 2 ships in near off the coast of Syria, somewhere. I'm not sure exactly where they were. I want to go for a second to Twitter.
Inviting another strike by the United States. It's a very clear message that the White House is trying to send tonight. And keep in mind, Don, the National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, when he was briefing reporters here earlier this evening, he very clearly said to reporters that no, that this strike tonight did not eliminate Bashar al-Assad's chemical weapons capabilities, and that those chemical weapons capabilities still exist. And so what the president is hoping tonight, from what I'm hearing from talking to top officials, is that he has laid down a marker to the Assad government that this has to stop, no more chemical weapons attacks, or there are going to be future consequences. And this official went on to say, sort of underlining the point, that the response from the international community has been, quote, extraordinarily positive. So the thought being inside the White House, I think at this point, Don, is that yes, that tonight's airstrikes against these chemical weapons capabilities in Syria were successful, but at the same time they feel like they have the international backing from the global community. If Bashar al-Assad strikes his people again with chemical weapons, that the U.S. is going to have essentially the backing of the global community to go ahead and do this again if it's necessary. Don?
A fair amount of positive backing here at home as well. Jim Acosta down in Florida. Jim, thank you very much. I want to bring back Fareed Zakaria now and General Marks. Also seen in
Congress, not just Democrats, but again, Republicans who were caught off guard by that. You know, this will be a test of how that working relationship can function right now, how Trump's top aides at the White House can work with congressional leaders and whether they can be on the same page when it comes to how the United States is dealing with Syria, or whether there will be really, really big disagreements coming. And that's what we're going to find out soon, I think.
All right, Sean Sullivan with the Washington Post. Sean, thanks very much for your insight. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
CBSN. CBS plus N as in news.
Another developing story out of the White
of resolve in the face of Assad's regime. Horrific actions will resonate not only in Damascus but in Tehran, Pyongyang, and elsewhere. What do you make of that?
Oh, I think more than just Israel. I think the Trump administration will get broad international support for what it's done, partly because, as Spider's been pointing out, it's fairly narrowly targeted. There isn't a danger of this turning into something larger and snowballing. But look, the Assad regime is a brutal, thuggish regime, and people have been trying to figure out some way to get its attention, to get it to, maybe adhere to some red lines. And, the big hope is, and Secretary Tillerson talked about this, to get the Assad regime to Geneva to talk about a political transition in Syria. The only hope for the end of violence in Syria is for some kind of political deal. Assad is not going to be able to rule the whole country, but his opponents are not going to be able to rule the whole country. So somebody has to share power. There will have to be either a partition or some kind of power-sharing deal. So everyone is going to look at this and hope that it maybe moves the ball forward.
But what will be the timeline to know if Assad continues to be a bad actor? What is the timeline here? We know chemical weapons, the president is saying, off limits, but does Assad still stay in place when we go back to the Obama administration?
The timeline is just what it's always been. This really is in many ways, in that larger strategic picture that you're asking on, this is a one-off because it doesn't degrade Assad's military capacity. Remember, he kills thousands and thousands of children with bombs, barrel bombs, and bullets. He kills lots of people to maintain his control. All that stays. He continues to try to maintain his part of Syria. ISIS is trying to maintain its part. Al-Qaeda is involved. Al-Nusra is involved. That 50-sided civil war continues. I don't think this has changed very much of anything other than maybe this red line about chemical weapons.
This was not about degrading Syria's capabilities, right? This was sending a message, as we have spoken about. But just to be clear, he did not seek the approval of any nation internationally.
No.
He simply notified.
Notification, and we're looking, the United States is looking for buy-in. So you pick up the phone and you talk to those folks that you're most interested in getting their support, and you say, this is what we're going to do, I'm letting you know. And then we also did that with Russia, just to inform them as well, to put their heads down.
Why the change now since 2013? I'll ask you, and then I'll ask Fareed as well. Why this change? Was it the pictures? He was affected by these 70-so people who, were killed in this, including children and babies. Why now? Because as Fareed said, hundreds of people are killed by barrel bombs and other...
All the time. Syria is guilty of immense acts of brutality that are horrendous, and they have been doing that for years. It has to do with context. Look what happened in 2013. President Obama was looking at 2013. We had just been able to get out of Iraq. Whether that was a good decision or not, we did. And we were also looking at that point, we were starting to, we had ramped up our presence in Afghanistan, and we were now trying to figure out how do we achieve a similar type of withdrawal or a normalcy in Afghanistan that we could sustain. And now we have this challenge in Syria, and I'm sure the president's calculation was, this is horrendous, but I can't afford to do this right now for whatever motivated him. I'm sure there were political motivations. I'm sure there were domestic motivations. There always are. Fast forward now, we have a new president, more bellicose in his speech. He's not dealing with those issues. This is his problem. President Obama is history.
It's certainly now with this. It's his.
And I hope, I pray that every issue that this administration sees right now, they will embrace as their own. You know, you embrace the chaos. You got to lean into the storm if you're going to have this. You got to weather the storm and get through it. It's yours.
It certainly is interesting because now we're talking about this, but it doesn't completely take Russia off the table, because how will Russia react to this? How does that? How do they fit into this entire thing? Because we said we have ISIS on the table, but also Russia is also complicit in what's happening in Syria.
And Iran. This is one of the most complicated international crises I've ever seen in my life, because you have many, many actors internally. You know, the CIA has estimated 1,000 different militias in Syria, but then you have many outside powers supporting various ones of these. But the core issue, I think, in terms of, to answer your question, Don, which is a really good one, because there are very few issues on which Donald Trump has been as consistent as he was on non-intervention in Syria. And I think what happened is a lot of what Spider said. I think Donald Trump thinks of himself as a tough guy. He confronted this issue, and his reflex was, I'm going to do something tough. And in this particular case, I think it's morally admirable that he wanted to do it. The danger here is, what if this doesn't change much on the ground? What if, in a sense, a few months from now, we're looking at the same Syrian civil war, and Assad is emboldened and empowered and defiant? Then, has the United States been humiliated? How will Donald Trump react to that idea? You know, this was one of the things that always dragged America further and further in foreign engagements, which is you commit a certain amount of American prestige, power, and credibility, and it doesn't work. Now, do you back down, or do you throw good money after bad?
I want to add two names to that scenario, and that is General Mattis and H.R. McMaster. President Trump decided he wanted to do this, but he didn't make the decision alone. Those two men weighed in, and they approved this. And there may be a question about what comes next, what comes tomorrow, you know, what kind of influence with Russia. But those are two experienced military men who said to him they thought this was okay.
I think that's, as Spider's been pointing out, they took his impulse and they translated it into a very narrow, limited, targeted policy, which is tactically very effective as a result. Yeah. One airfield, one set of strikes, you're in and you're out, and it's over.
But I've got to ask this, Jamie, since you've been speaking to folks in Washington, just on the political side, right? His advisors know that this changes the narrative from what had been, the news had been about him.
Right, so let's be realistic for a moment. I was here tonight because we were supposed to be talking about palace intrigue and what was going on in the White House and who was up and who was down, and is Steve Bannon out of power now, and is Jared Kushner. That seems, you know, prosaic in comparison to trivial in comparison to what's going on now, but it does. This does change the discussion, and it's going to change it for several more days.
Yes. And I hope it changes the man. I hope that one thing that this does is make Donald Trump realize he's president of the United States, he's leader of the world. He should put away the Twitter app. He should recognize that he is making decisions about war and peace, take them as seriously as he can, do the best he can, and, you know, enough with the antics, enough with the social media.
I love that. I don't think Twitter is going away. And actually, I was thinking, I wonder what the first tweet will be.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, will he suddenly realize the gravity of the position that he's in now because of all of this and put down Twitter? But we'll see. Maybe it does change the man. But, you know, as we've been talking about, it changes the narrative. But as my colleague Wolf Blitzer knows in Washington, it all gets back to politics very quickly. But this is certainly a very serious military operation underway right now, Wolf.
59 Tomahawk cruise missiles targeting this Syrian air base. I want to bring in Rear Admiral John Kirby once again, retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. Also joining us, retired Lieutenant Colonel Rick Francona. And Rick, you've been to this air base, the El Shayrat air base in Syria. You were a former U.S. military attaché in Syria. Tell us a little bit about this base.
Well, it's not one of their larger air bases. It's pretty utilitarian, kind of bare bones. It's got basically 2 runways, 2 squadron areas, and they have 2 squadrons of aircraft there, Sukhoi 22s. This is an older, reliable Russian air-to-ground bomber. It's the backbone of the Syrian air-to-ground effort. They've got a lot of them, and they fly them every day. And this base here is a very nice, it's a very great location because they can get from this base up into that Idlib province where much of the fighting is going on now. You know, after the fall of Aleppo, almost all of the bombing shifted to the southwest of Aleppo into that Idlib province. So this is a very centrally located base. It doesn't surprise me at all that this was the base used to launch this attack the other day. So you've got 2 squadrons there, and also your administrative area, refueling area, armament area, and all that. It's kind of isolated. There are only a couple of small towns around it, so the chances of civilian casualties in like a neighboring city would be very, very minimized. So it was a good target to pick, and as I said, it's not very big. 59 Tomahawks will definitely make an impact.
They certainly will, from 2 U.S. ships in the eastern Mediterranean. The statement put out by the Pentagon, Colonel Francona, from the Pentagon spokesman, Captain Jeff Davis, among other things, says this: Russian forces were notified in advance of the strike using the established deconfliction line. U.S. military planners took precautions to minimize risks to Russian or Syrian personnel located at the airfield. So that basically means what? The Syrians and the Russians at that air base were told, go into bunkers because U.S. cruise missiles are on the way?
I don't know what the timeline was. I don't know how much advance notice they got. I know that we have often conducted these strikes at night just to minimize the number of casualties. We want to blow up things and facilities, not necessarily kill people. So I think that was probably the thinking behind that. But, you know, all the aircraft should have been stored in these hardened aircraft shelters. Each squadron area has enough shelters to store their 12 aircraft. And if they're in those hardened aircraft shelters, it would take more than 1 Tomahawk to take out those shelters. But, you know, as the Admiral has said before, these are very precise weapons. And it's not inconceivable. You could put 1, 2, 3 Tomahawks into one of these shelters and obliterate what's inside. So all in all, I think this was a good target to hit. 59 Tomahawks sounds about right. And I think it sends the right message but without risking a lot of collateral damage.
Admiral Kirby, they said in the Pentagon statement that the 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles targeted aircraft, hardened aircraft shelters, petroleum and logistical storage, as well as ammunition supply bunkers, air defense systems, and radars. If they hit all of that, it would have been a pretty successful operation, right?
Oh, without question. And my guess is if that's what they were targeting, and they used nearly 60 Tomahawks to launch these strikes, that they probably hit all that stuff, and therefore can say, I think, truthfully, that they very much had a degradation effect on the Syrian Air Force, particularly, well, especially at that base. But that's a significant set of targets and a significant number of missiles to go get it.
And let me bring in our other military analyst who's with us, General Hertling. The statement also said, and it's very significant, the statement says this air base, the El Sharat airfield, was used to store chemical weapons and Syrian air forces. So the U.S., and this is where the chemical weapons attack that killed all those civilians, including a lot of children, it was launched, the Syrian fighter jets launched from this specific air base. But if the U.S. knew there were still chemical weapons there, storage of chemical weapons, this was clearly, once again, a violation of what the Russians had promised in 2013, that the Syrians would destroy all their chemical weapons capabilities.
Well, it's not only a violation of that, Wolf, it's also a violation of international law. There's a chemical warfare prevention requirement of all nations that are signatories of the Geneva Convention. So just knowing that this was there and knowing that it was going to be used is not only a bane on the Syrian military and government, but also, as stated in the statements, against Russia's too. One of the things, if I can go back to the question you asked both Rick and John, the comment about the precision of the strikes, 59 or 60 Tomahawk missiles targeting facilities, targeting hardened shelters, not targeting people, and in fact being given warnings either informally or in a nuanced way to both Syrian and Russian government. juxtapose that against what has been happening not only with the Syrian military dropping arbitrarily barrel bombs and dumb bombs on civilian populations, but also the support they've received from the Russian military in doing the same thing. That's arbitrary killing of anybody who happens to be in the battle or to try and
The brunt of the aggression by the Syrian regime now for well over 6 years. But it's important to keep in mind when looking at the situation in Syria that the vast number of the victims of this regime, more than 400,000, they were killed by the regime, not by ISIS. And therefore, many Syrians will be happy to see some sort of punishment given to the Syrian regime, even though at the moment, until just a few days ago, our focus, at least as journalists here and in Iraq, was very much on ISIS. And of course, the worry is that with a weakened Syrian regime, there may be a vacuum into which, of course, ISIS will rush, which has always been the case in this area when it comes to the weakening of an old regime and something that takes its place. So it's a volatile and dangerous situation, regardless of how it plays out. Don?
Ben, and let's dig in a little bit more with that, because you have been reporting for years now that the Syrian people had given up hope for any American action. So how do you think they're going to react to this attack? For years
I think
now,
many people will
that the
be
Syrian
saying,
people
Don,
have given up hope for any American action.
It's too little,
so
too
how do you think they're
late,
going to
given
react to
that
this
the
attack?
more than 400,000 people have been killed I think in the many Syrian people will civil be saying, war Don, so it's a little,
far.
It's too little,
It's interesting
too late, that the more than
there were real high
400,000 people
hopes during
have
the
been killed in the Syrian civil war that
so
he
far.
would do something.
It's
After
interesting
all,
that
the Americans
there were
who
real
supported the Libyan uprising. They were a bit late in Egypt, but they supported a change of regime there. But in Syria, of course, the administration of Barack Obama found that that was a very hard nut to crack. The Syrian regime was not easily undermined, and of course they had the undying support of the Russians. So I think that people, you know, the sort of people we've been speaking to who witnessed the attack the other day that left so many people killed, that chemical attack, they will be happy to see that the Syrian government pays a price for what it did. But, you know, this is not just a one-off thing. What comes next? Is this something just for the new administration to say, look, we did something? Or is it the beginning of a serious attempt to, as we heard the Secretary of State Tillerson say, to change the regime in Syria? And of course, you know, when you're talking about regime change, and I said it before, who are the other players? Who could replace the regime of Bashar al-Assad? At the moment, the only force strong enough, I'm afraid, is ISIS.
Yes, ISIS. Listen, and we're going to talk about what that means for ISIS. Is that an opening for ISIS, which many of our experts have been discussing here? But Ben, in a statement tonight, the president spoke about the refugee crisis, saying in part, years of previous attempts at changing Assad's behavior have all failed, and failed very dramatically. As a result, the refugee crisis continues to deepen, and the region continues to destabilize, threatening the United States and its allies. Turkey has taken in a lot of Syrian refugees. What impact do you think this is going to have on the people in that region?
Well, as I said, I think, you know, if this was just one-off thing, 59 cruise missiles fired in Syria, it's not going to make much of a difference. If it's the beginning of some sort of effort to change the regime in Damascus, it will have a huge impact. Now, Turkey, yes, it hosts millions of Syrian refugees at considerable expense. The Turkish government has been pushing for years for the United States to take a stronger position, to take action, to change the regime in Damascus. They certainly, in fact, just yesterday, the Turkish president did say that if any action is to be taken against the regime in Syria, it should be more than just words, and that Turkey will do whatever is needed to help in that effort. Doc?
Ben Wiedemann on the Syria-Turkey border reporting for us. Thank you, Ben.
This is CNN Breaking News.
This is our breaking news. President Trump orders U.S. military strikes on Syria. This is CNN Tonight. I'm Don Lemon.
And I'm Wolf Blitzer. You're looking at the first video of the strike on the Syrian government targets. That's in retaliation for Syria's chemical weapons attack on civilians earlier in the week, and a lot of children were killed in that attack. On President Trump's orders, U.S. warships launched 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles targeting a Syrian government air base where the warplanes that carried out the chemical attacks were based. The missiles were launched from warships in the eastern Mediterranean, 2 U.S. warships.
And a senior administration official, Wolf, says that the president was very affected by the images of dead children among the civilian casualties in the Syrian chemical weapons attack, and he felt compelled to act. You could see that today in his reaction.
It certainly was. It had a powerful impact on the president. I want to bring in our Pentagon correspondent, Barbara Starr. Barbara, you're getting a lot of briefings over there. Give us the latest that's coming out of the Pentagon.
Well, Wolf, here's where we stand at this hour. 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles hitting this air base in western Syria. We know some more details now about this base. We know that the U.S. believes that the Syrians, prior to 2013, stored sarin nerve agent there. And, in fact, as they struck it today, the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, told reporters that they took special precautions to avoid hitting areas at the base where they still think that there is sarin stored there. Throughout the day, the U.S. talked to the Russians because the Russians had people there to let the Russians know what the U.S. was going to do and when it was going to happen. This has now raised the very critical question: how much did the Russians know about what was going on at that airbase? How much did they know about that sarin or that nerve agent strike against Syrian people earlier in the week? How complicit were the Russians in all of it? When the Tomahawks rolled in on this airfield, they struck taxiways, they struck aircraft shelters, fueling points, ammunition storage, air defense, and radars. All the things to basically put this base out of commission for the time being. Is it a permanent solution? Is it going to get Assad to change his behavior? Likely not right away, but it is going to demonstrate to him and the world that this president is willing to use military action. The military had given the president a number of options earlier in the week. This is the one he selected, very visible to the world, very much sending a message. Wolf?
Just want to be precise, Barbara. There are plenty of other contingencies, plenty of other options the U.S. military has if the president orders more airstrikes.
That is absolutely right. The U.S. military always, as you know better than anybody, Wolf, has multiple options to present to a commander-in-chief for whatever he chooses to do. So the question now is, will President Trump decide that he wants to take this further? You know, the additional targets at various locations around Syria would be helicopters, barrel bombs, those nerve agent-filled bombs that are tossed out of helicopters, manufacturing and fabrication for nerve agents, and the artillery and rockets that can also deliver these kinds of deadly agents. This isn't just a problem from the air, from aircraft or helicopters. It can be delivered on the ground. But the more targets, the more places you're going to run into where there may well be Russian or Iranian-backed forces or civilians. It becomes a very complex issue. If you take it further, we asked tonight, does the president plan to go further? The answer we got, well, you know, wait and see if additional decisions are made. Wolf?
And very quickly, Barbara, I used to be a Pentagon correspondent, as you well know, during the first Gulf War. But usually when the U.S. is engaged in military strikes, the building where you are is buzzing. It's now after midnight here on the East Coast, and it suggests that maybe more activity is planned. What's the activity level at the Pentagon right now in some of those command structures?
Well, let me say this. The Pentagon was extremely busy through most of the day, all 17 and a half miles of corridors buzzing away. Tonight, downstairs, the command center continues 24/7 as it does every night. There are people on station. This becomes an interesting question because, this is happening on the other side of the world. So the U.S. has considerable military power in the region. There are command centers, Baghdad, Kuwait, up and down the Persian Gulf, where aircraft and ships are located. So there's an ability to communicate throughout the night. They will watch very carefully to see if there's any reaction from the Syrian government, from the Russians, any kind of military retaliation. We haven't seen any of that, but that's what they'll be partially watching for through the middle of the night, to make sure the Syrians don't decide to make a move in retaliation. Everyone is very aware just over Syria's borders in one direction. You have Israel, you have Jordan, you have Lebanon. The Israelis quite capable, as you know, of looking after themselves in these matters. The Jordanians, the Lebanese, Hezbollah, all the groups influencing those areas very much being watched tonight. A lot of caution. There are neighbors, there are countries on the border that are fragile, that may need help if this was a situation to grow, Wolf.
It will be important to see the official Russian reaction, Barbara, but the official Iranian reaction, given Iran's involvement in Syria, bolstering Bashar al-Assad's regime through Hezbollah and other militias, Iranian-backed militias, that will be significant as well.
Well, it will be. I think it's fair to say that the U.S. view, President Obama, President Trump, I don't think is going to have a very different view, is that these groups that are trying to influence the region, the Iranian-backed groups that have moved throughout the region, Syria, into Lebanon, Hezbollah, that these are groups and Iranian-backed militias that are trying to influence the situation in a way that is very detrimental to seeing a solution. So again,
getting a statement from the Russians on Syria any moment now. About 30 minutes back they came out, the foreign ministry said expect that statement to be made public at some point. And of course also to remind our viewers that the Chinese will be having a foreign press briefing foreign press briefing at 1500, I believe, 3 p.m. Beijing time. So stay tuned, of course. And really depending on the wording of those statements will really tell us whether or not this move by the U.S. has moved the needle on the issue of Syria.
At least when it comes to the markets, it has moved the needle. Right. Markets just reacting violently to that attack in Syria. Let's get the details from Sophie Kamaruni. Sophie.
Yeah, guys, this launch of an attack against Syria by the United States, that was a surprise to traders. So financial assets getting whipsawed today. It is mostly a down day across Asian equity markets. We are seeing volatility rise in Hong Kong, Sydney, and Tokyo. But we are seeing stocks on the Nikkei 225 managing to resume the earlier climb, along with the topics here after briefly erasing a rally. Chinese stocks also keeping afloat, as well as stocks in Manila up about 1% there. But we do have the Kospi falling for a fourth day, along with shares in Tokyo, Southeast Asia, and Hong Kong. Shares on the Hang Seng falling over 1% here, and H shares also sliding for a second day. Taking a look at the currency space, the Taiwanese dollar, that is leading the drop in Asian Forex. That is falling for a sixth day. Southeast Asian currencies also taking a hit today, and the won, that is falling by the most since mid-March. We also have the Aussie sliding 0.1%, weighed by falling iron ore prices. Speaking of commodities, we have gold up about 0.9%. It's nearing a 5-month high here, which is driving a broader rally in precious metals, and we could be seeing 1,300 in sight for bullion here. And we do have oil spiking, WTI up over $52 a barrel. Earlier, we had Brent breaching the 56 level here, but Nomura is saying that price gains could be capped as geopolitical risks may prove temporary, given that Syria is no longer a significant oil producer. Now, taking a look at the broader Forex markets, the Japanese yen, no surprise, leading gains here, and it may test 110 a dollar. We haven't seen that level since November. And the Turkish lira, that is taking the biggest hit here, given its proximity to Syria. Mizuho saying that along with the lira, the Russian ruble, as well as the Korean won, they are the most sensitive to the U.S. strike. Mizuho EM trader Masakatsu Fukaya, she is taking a cautious stance on the won, considering the talks between Trump and Xi over North Korea. We do have Macquarie's head of FX strategy, Nizam Idris, saying that this strike will send a piercing message to Pyongyang that there are consequences if they were to mess up. So he does see a more persistent reaction for currencies like the won. Guys.
Yeah, Sophie, thank you so much. And we do have the latest breaking lines out of Russia. Russia senator saying that the U.S. strikes were meant to assign blame for Idlib. Of course, those were the gas attacks that killed scores of people just 2 days ago. We are hearing now from a Russia senator saying that the U.S. strikes were meant to assign blame for Idlib. Don't forget that we have heard from Secretary of State Rex Tillerson saying that Russia has been complicit or incompetent on Syria. Also, the Russian Federation Council member Kosakyov comments on Facebook saying that those strikes were meant to assign blame for those gas attacks.
Yeah, but of course, just to mention here as well, Sherry, of course, we're hearing from the senator. He's also the chairman of the International Committee there. So that's, of course, we'll bring you more, of course, details when we do get that official statement out of Russia. But we are, of course, getting bits and pieces out, of course. And I guess in a lot of ways, it sort of gives you an indication of which way, unsurprisingly, Russia is, of course, tilted. Let's bring back our guest this hour, Uwe Parpar. He's chief strategist with Capital Link International. Uwe, we were speaking about an hour back, and I guess just looking at equity markets, you were right. It's a sort of buy and dip situation because we're off the lows of the day. The other thing, though, I do want to mention is that now that I guess we sort of know where the Russians are going to be on this, the Chinese, we're yet to hear from them later on. Is this a case, and put your trader's hat on, is this a case to start going long on the VIX, the Nikkei VIX, the Hang Seng VIX, or whatever implied volatility measure that we have out there?
Well, I think one of the important things to keep in mind that this Syria attack was also probably a sort of a dual-purpose operation warning North Korea that the United States is prepared to take unilateral action, as President Trump has said. So Korea comes into play here. And if you look at equity markets, if you look at everything else at the moment, for me, this is a buying opportunity actually in Korea, because I think it's clear that we are going to be looking at a situation in which China and the United States are going to make every possible effort to actually rein in the North Korean operations.
And when we talk about risk-off sentiment in Asia, we can't but talk about the Japanese yen, which is now continuing to strengthen. Does this sort of discourage you from the Japanese market?
Well, of course. I mean, it's one of the best-known factors, I think, in the world, the close correlation between the Nikkei and the Japanese yen, or rather the inverse correlation. And therefore, if you see a strengthening of the yen, this will be negative to the Nikkei. But I'd also like to point out that the strengthening of the yen is not just something that happened today. It's been going on now for, the last 10 days or so, from about 115 to 110. This is more related to the broader issue of the strength of the U.S. dollar. And I think this will come back. And therefore, I think once the immediate reaction here is over, we will see a reversal, perhaps not a very fast reversal, but a reversal of the strength of the yen.
Uwe, very quickly, and not to trivialize, of course, the events this morning, if I had cash sitting on the sidelines leading up to today, do I deploy that cash now?
Yes, I think so. As I said, these are, as usually when people talk about this metaphorically about blood in the streets, that's the good time to think about investing. You have to think about where is there an opportunity, and I see a good opportunity in Korea. We had great results from Samsung, which is really the Korean index. I would put some money there. It's a risky bet, obviously, but one that would pay off well if you're right.
Uwe, thank you for joining us there. Uwe Parpar, of course, from Capital Link Security. Thank you for joining us on the program. Fairly eventful, of course, morning here across markets in the Asia-Pacific.
And we do have another line coming out from the news agency in Russia saying that the country is seeking a UN Security Council meeting on the Syria strike. So we'll get you the details when we get them. And, of course, we are awaiting that foreign ministry statement also out of Russia, not to mention out of China as well, on some reaction to to the attacks by the U.S. on Syria. And of course, you can follow all of these developments, the day's trading as well, how all of this is impacting the markets. That would be on the Markets Live blog. That's on the Bloomberg at MLIV Go.
Yep, you can get, of course, a rundown. One click, and there's commentary across assets, if you will. So, I mean, you look what's happening with the lira. You look across the bond space. We're seeing yields on the way down. Expert editors, of course, commentary, and of course at Live Lock. You can find that out, what's really affecting your investments right now. MLive Go on your Bloomberg.
Right, let's continue talking about the implications of this attack with Bloomberg's Andrew Barden, who's joining us now from Dubai. So, Andrew, give us an overview of the reaction that you've seen in Gulf countries in the Middle East. Of course, right now what we're seeing is just oil spiking.
Well, we haven't seen any reaction from Gulf countries yet. It's still early. We've seen early reports out of Syria from the governor of Homs saying that there were some casualties. We don't have the figures yet. And then rebels are saying that up to 14 jets may have been hit in the strike. So we're starting to get some of the details. I'm sure that that'll be coming quickly. What this does do for an already crowded battlefield is certainly muddy the waters even more. You've got coalition planes in the air. You've got Russian troops there. You've got Iranian involvement. You've got Turkish forces. And the U.S., which is part of this coalition that had been bombing Islamic State and other terror groups, is now adding Tomahawk missiles to the mix. So very crowded battlefield becomes even more muddied.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a line, in fact, here, just coming across the terminal, that Russia and U.S. militaries, unsurprising, may be halting their cooperation, which you alluded to there earlier, in Syria. Talk to us more about Turkey. I'm looking at the markets right now. When you look at the lira, it's really leading the declines across EM currencies for one reason or another. And I guess, of course, a lot of that really also just comes back to the fact that they are also involved in this very complex situation there. Where does Turkey go with all of this?
Well, to be honest, I think a lot of what's driving Turkish markets is the referendum that we're going to have in a few days on whether the presidency gets more executive powers. Turkey has been consistent in calling for Assad to go. Turkey now has forces that are in Syria. They've launched their own mission there. I suspect, I haven't seen any reaction yet, I suspect that they will welcome this. After, Trump came out and said that this goes way beyond red lines, Turkish ministers came out and said, yeah, great, we agree with you, now do something about it. And so the fact that Trump has been so quick and so forceful with his response, I suspect will be welcomed by Turkey. I'll be looking very closely to see what Russian reaction is. You said, the two sides, that the U.S. and Russia do coordinate. They coordinate in the sense that they tell each other where their planes are so they don't accidentally shoot each other out of the sky. And to be confirmed, but I suspect that the U.S. would have done something similar in this case to avoid any accidental strikes against Russian assets. Were that cooperation to cease, if Russia were to, and the U.S. would suddenly stop telling each other, where their planes are, it could be very, it could lead to some accidental strikes, which would obviously be of great concern to all there.
Andrew Barden in Dubai, do stick around because we do want to get to you again, but let's cross over it now to Beijing for the reaction there. Our China correspondent Tom McKenzie joining us now. Tom, of course, this coming at a crucial time when President Xi Jinping is visiting the U.S. So what can we expect to hear from the Chinese?
We're expecting a comment, likely from the Foreign Ministry at around 3 p.m. local time, a little under 2 hours. And don't expect any big reactionary comments from the Chinese. Expect to hear from them that they will likely call for an easing of tensions, potentially for peace talks between the different parties involved in this. There's a couple of things to bear in mind vis-à-vis China and its relationship with Syria and Russia, of course, as well. In the past, China has sided with Russia in vetoing any UN resolutions targeting Syria, including the one that was drawn up after the last chemical attack And so that is something to bear in mind with this as well.
Tom, just a minute. We are just getting, of course, some comments here. We're going live right now to Sydney, where Malcolm Turnbull is, of course, also really chiming in, if you will, and really talking about, listen in, of course, what's been happening there.
The effect of the American response has been to reduce the ability of the Syrian government to deliver chemical weapons in the shocking manner in which they did a few days ago. The United States advised us as a coalition partner shortly prior to the attack. As the Minister will describe, the United States Secretary of Defence, Jim Mattis, phoned her earlier this morning. We have discussed the matter, naturally, with the CDF and with our National Security Committee colleagues, and we can say that the Australian government strongly supports the swift and just response of the United States. This was a calibrated, proportionate and targeted response. It sends a strong message to the Assad regime, and as I said, has been struck at the very airfield from which the chemical attack was delivered. Australia was not involved in the strike, but we remain fully committed as a coalition partner to our ongoing military operations in Iraq and Syria. We have been consistent in our condemnation of the use of chemical weapons in Syria and elsewhere. The use of these weapons under any circumstances is illegal and abhorrent. It's a violation of international law. It is a war crime, and it is a blatant contravention of basic principles of humanity. These crimes against humanity, shocking and horrific even in the context of the Syrian conflict zone, cannot be committed with impunity, and the perpetrators must be held to account. We've called on the Security Council to address this matter as soon as possible, but regrettably, as we have seen, the Security Council is once again at an impasse due to the position of the Assad regime supporter, Russia. Now, we remain fully committed, as I said, to our ongoing operations in Iraq and Syria against Daesh. We're in close discussions with our allies on the next steps. This is a vitally important signal, a vitally important message that we will not tolerate, the world will not tolerate, the use of these chemical weapons.
That was Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull speaking in Sydney, talking about the U.S. airstrikes in Syria, that they were calibrated and proportionate, saying that that reduces Syria's chemical attack capabilities. So.
Yeah, very quickly, just want to check in on the energy markets right now. Of course, 56 earlier on was your session high here for Brent crude. We're at 55.62, and of course, you make your way down. Of course, we're also seeing a reaction there as far as precious metals are concerned. GLC, of course, on your Bloomberg. Right, let's get further reaction and flesh this out further with Rick Spooner, Chief Market Analyst at CMC Markets. He joins us on the phone from Sydney. Rick, thanks for joining us. So, does this change dynamics in the oil market at all, or is this a one-off?
Well, look, at this stage, I think it's a one-off. I think today's move is probably just a precautionary one in case things escalate. But as is widely known, Syria's oil production these days is fairly negligible, so that unless this does escalate in a way that causes disruption to some of the nearby Middle East producers like Iran and Iraq, I think it will be a fairly temporary situation.
Yeah, when it comes to oil prices, it will be dependent also on what happens with OPEC. Now, some countries have mentioned extending the reduction deal that we've seen so far. How much of a boost will these new developments in the region give to prices?
Look, I suspect it'll be fairly temporary unless the situation does escalate. I would anticipate that we may see oil prices just stay elevated for a day or two while markets make sure that there's going to be no immediate reaction. But unless we see real tangible signs of sort of escalation that could in fact disrupt supplies in other of the major OPEC producers, that the market will probably begin to discount it.
Rick, yeah, and I guess what we have to remind our viewers, and very good point that you made there, it's not a major oil producer, Syria, but it also borders, of course, Iraq, which is a major oil producer. Let's go back to fundamentals and really try and flesh out what's knee-jerk reaction and where we are as fair value for oil is concerned. At 55, which was the starting point for the day before these events took place, was that a reasonable, if you will, price for oil? We've seen it creep up slowly in recent days.
Yes, it's probably reasonable. I do think we're potentially getting towards the high end of the range for oil, absent any major supply disruption, of course. I think, you know, what's transpired over the last couple of months and caught many, probably including myself, by surprise is the extent of the increase in US production and other places, and the price at which they've done it. So it's pretty clear that shale oil is pretty interested in maintaining and increasing production in that sort of low 50s range for the US oil price, or the high 50s range for Brent, and I suspect that we're probably would struggle to get past 60, I think, for Brent at the moment, given the underlying fundamentals anyway.
Rick Spooner, thank you so much for joining us. He's of CMC Markets, the chief market analyst there.
Yeah, you know, let's look at the Bloomberg right now. OPEC Go, just very quickly, just to put this into context, of course, Syria, a blip when it comes, of course, the oil production. But, of course, when you look at Iraq, I alluded to this earlier, fairly big. Have a look at my Bloomberg right now. 4,430 there as far as production is concerned in March. This is the number I'm talking about. And, of course, we're also looking at Saudi Arabia. When you look at the pie chart, just to give you a very quick snapshot of where the potential hotspots are. We're not there yet, of course, just to emphasize that.
Yeah, and a lot to do with crude outputs as well, as we consecutively see those increases. We'll get you more details on the markets with the GMM Go function after the break. This is Bloomberg.
In San Francisco, a lot of tech action today.
Our top stories this morning in D.C. and
the Dow and the S&P.
Shall we? So the euro on a 7-day
sizable moves in the currency market. Averages down 0.5%.
We begin in the oil patch. Saudi Arabia.
Brent crude pretty much unchanged.
Welcome to Bloomberg, the first word Asia.
U.S. and Japan duke it out over exchange.
China's slumping onshore bond market is